Distinguished guests, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is historic as it is consequential. This is a very significant moment and a solemn one at that. It is solemn because today we seek to make amends for harms that have never been truly repaid. No compensation can restore a life lost. No reparation can fully erase the pain of a parent who buried a child, a spouse who lost a partner, or a family forever changed by tragedy. It is also solemn because I wish that our late brother, the statesman Raila Odinga, was here with us today. But I want to thank his brother, now party leader of ODM, Dr. Oburu Oginga, for making it to this function. And party leader, I want to apologize for the late notification for this meeting. Although you have spoken and made a statement that is more profound than those who prepared to come for this meeting. This is one of the commitments we made to the Kenyan people. It was born out of a shared conviction that Kenya could not continue traveling the same painful road, generation after generation, protest after protest, tragedy after tragedy. Today, we take an important step towards fulfilling that commitment. I am happy that the Honorable Oburu Odinga is here to represent my late brother, the Honorable Raila Odinga. Many have spoken about these issues over the years. Many have acknowledged the pain. Many have promised action. Today, however, we move beyond words. I stand here pleased that we have reached this milestone, saddened by the circumstances that have made it necessary, humbled by the trust of the ocean, placed in us by victims and their families, and optimistic that this marks the beginning of the end of a painful chapter in our national life. Our country has been undergoing profound socio-economic and political transformation. Across Kenya, citizens have consistently expressed a desire for a future that is more just, more inclusive, and more responsive to their aspirations. Never before, however, have Kenyans expressed such a deep and widespread yearning for change and renewal. That yearning is legitimate, it is democratic, and it is protected by the Constitution. The right to assemble, demonstrate, picket, and petition under Article 37 is not a favor from the state. It is a constitutional guarantee. It is one of the freedoms that define us as a democratic nation. Yet, we must also confront an uncomfortable truth. For far too long, whenever Kenyans have exercised these rights, too often, the outcome has been violent, injury, loss of life, destruction of property, bitterness, and division. Families have buried loved ones. Young people have carried physical and emotional scars. Businesses have been destroyed. Police officers have been injured. Communities have been left traumatized. We must also acknowledge a difficult reality. There has been instances where the response to public demonstrations has resulted in excessive use of force, violations of rights, and loss of life. Equally, there has been occasions when legitimate protests have been infiltrated by criminal elements, leading to violence, looting, destruction, and harm to both citizens and law enforcement officers. The truth is that whenever this cycle unfolds, Kenya loses. Citizens lose. Families lose. Businesses lose. The police lose. And our democracy is diminished. Then, almost predictably, the blame game begins. One side points to police brutality. Another points to criminal elements and organized violence, to goons. Politicians trade accusations. Television studios fill with rage and outrage. The nation mourns, and then we move on, only to repeat the cycle again. Perhaps what is most painful is how easily the suffering of victims is sometimes reduced to political slogans. It is easy to exploit public grief for political gain. It is easy to seek headlines, applause, and partisan advantage. What is much harder is to sit with the families who have lost loved ones, to listen to those carrying physical and emotional wounds years after the cameras have left, to comfort those whose businesses were destroyed, whose livelihoods disappeared, and whose futures were altered forever. That is why we must resist the temptation to turn national tragedy into political theater. The lives of Kenyans are too precious, the wounds too deep, for us to treat them as instruments of political competition. For decades, successive political generations have condemned these tragedies without fundamentally resolving them. I understand why. It is not easy to confront such issues. If you act, you are criticized. If you do not act, you are criticized. You are, in many ways and in many respects, damned if you do and damned if you don't. But there comes a point when a nation must choose action over hesitation. There comes a point when the cost of doing nothing becomes greater than the cost of trying to do something. Leadership is not about choosing what is comfortable. It is about choosing what is necessary. And so, we have chosen to act, not for ourselves, not for political advantage, but for Kenya. Our commitment is not in words alone. It is also in deeds. I remember very well when we discussed this both in the NADCO framework and also in the 10-point agenda UDA ODM framework. And I remember the occasion that has been spoken to by the Honorable Junet and the Honorable Oburu, when I had occasion with the late Prime Minister Raila Odinga. And when I told him that I had made the decision because of the consultations we had had, that it was time to compensate the victims and to set up a framework for reparations. And he encouraged me and he told me, Mr. President, this is the right thing to do. And let's do it now. I remember also that subsequently, when I issued the proclamation, Professor Makau here, who rarely asks for my time, asked for an opportunity to see me. And he came and we sat down, I think somewhere in there, here, and he told me, Mr. President, I never knew that you would agree to do this. Because in many respects, it amounts to admission by you and government. And so I told him, we have buried our heads in the sand for far too long. And it's time for us as a nation, and for me as the leader of the nation, to stand up, own up, and do something about it. That is why, through Gazette Notice number 12002 of 2025 and other instruments, I set in motion the process of compensating victims of protests and public unrest. As part of that process, I appointed a distinguished panel chaired by Professor Makau Mutua, honoring a commitment that I had made together with my friend, the late former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, that we would not merely speak about this issue, but walk the journey to its conclusion. I tasked the panel with helping us confront a challenge that Kenya had carried for far too long, and with developing a framework that would place victims, justice, accountability, and national reconciliation at its center. Subsequently, the court directed that the framework be developed by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And that is why today we gather to launch the fruit of that work. And as was said earlier, I subsequently issued Presidential Proclamation number 1 of 2026 in accordance with Article 2542 of the Constitution, charging the Kenya National Human Commission on Human Rights with the responsibility of developing and submitting a framework to guide the provision of compensation for victims of human rights violations, including those arising from public protests. The proclamation was subsequently published as Kenya Gazette number 3114. I wish to commend the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights for their dedication, wisdom, and patriotism in delivering this framework for compensation and reparations to victims of human rights violations during protests and picketing. Madam Clarice Oganga and your team, you have discharged this responsibility in honor of those who have suffered this injustice and to the benefit of the nation, not an individual, not a group of individuals. And I want to commend you. Your statement has been profound. I have listened very carefully on what you have had to say about this responsibility and mandate, and it has spoken to all the issues that would have required attention in this exercise. I also wish to commend Professor Mutua and the panel for their invaluable contribution to this process. Professor, again, and the panel, I want to say congratulations and thank you very much for making a contribution. Allow me to say, when the courts pronounce themselves on how this exercise should be carried forward, I got advice from different people. One group said the court, we should appeal this decision of the court. Another group said we should implement whatever the court has said in the interest of time. So when I assessed, to me, it didn't matter who did what, but it mattered to the victims and to the country that for once we try and resolve this issue. And I want to thank again Professor Makau, who came to consult with me. And we agreed with him that while it was okay for us to go to court and appeal, but we must also agree with the court, proceed with the process, so that Kenyans can for once know that we are committed to our word. This framework represents a major milestone in protecting the rights of those harmed during protests, advancing social reconciliation, providing redress for victims, and strengthening our democracy. As a demonstration of our commitment, we have already allocated Kenya shillings 2 billion towards compensation and reparation for those who have suffered verified harm arising from protests and unrest, including affected families, injured citizens, businesses lost, and law enforcement officers injured in the course of their duties. But let me be clear. This is, as has been said by many, the beginning of the journey, not the end. Let me also be clear about what these payments are and what they are not. They are not the price of life, of pain, or of loss. No amount of money could ever be. The Kenya shillings 2 billion we have committed cannot replace a son or a daughter. It cannot restore years and lot of trauma. It cannot fully compensate a family, a trader, or a community for all that has been taken away from them. What it does represent is the state's acknowledgement that harm occurred, that victims matter, and that a nation heals by tending to its wounds rather than pretending they do not exist. Nor is this redress a reward for violence, looting, criminality, or unlawful conduct. Neither should it be understood as a license for disorder on one hand, or excesses and violations of rights on the other. It is redress for harm suffered by citizens, an affirmation that the rule of law applies equally to everyone. And let no one mistake compassion for impunity. Compensation does not retire accountability. The law applies equally to the citizen and the officer, to the protester and the police. Where wrongdoing occurred, accountability must follow its proper course. I have come to see our country as a single body. It has many parts, and no two are alike. The hand is not the foot. The eye is not the ear. Yet all belong to one body and share one life. When a thorn pierces the foot, it is not the foot alone that suffers. The whole body stops to remove it. So it is with us. The young person injured in a protest, the trader who lost a lifetime's work to looting, the police officer hurt while keeping the peace, and the family mourning a loved one are not rival camps. They are all Kenyans. They are all part of one national body. When any one of them is wounded, Kenya is wounded. And a nation does not heal by choosing whose pain matters. It heals by acknowledging all suffering, pursuing justice for all, and committing itself to doing better. That is why this framework is only the beginning. The journey will be complete only when we achieve two other things. First, a comprehensive legal framework that fully operationalizes and protects the rights guaranteed under Article 37 of our Constitution. The right to assemble, demonstrate, picket, and petition peacefully. I'm happy that the Kenya Human Rights Commission have undertaken to work with all the stakeholders to develop this law that will operationalize and protect the rights guaranteed under Article 37 of our Constitution. Secondly, to reform and have a training manual that reshape our police service and how they manage public demonstrations, ensuring professionalism, restraint, accountability, and respect for constitutional rights. Together, these reforms will strengthen the health of our democracy. Because compensation, properly understood, is not an end in itself. Compensation addresses the consequences of past failure, but reform must prevent their recurrence. We must also recognize a new challenge of our time. Artificial intelligence and digital platforms have transformed how information is created, shared, and consumed, especially among young people. While these technologies have expanded access to information, created new opportunities for learning, innovation, and commerce, and enriched democratic participation, they can also be used and have been used to spread misinformation, manipulate public discourse, inflame tensions, and fuel unrest. We must therefore be firm that technology must serve truth, responsibility, and national unity, not deception, division, and violence. If we remain committed to this path, this framework will mark more than the compensation of victims. It will mark the beginning of the end of a painful chapter in our national life. A chapter in which demonstrations often ended in injury, loss of life, destruction, and division. A chapter that has burdened generations of Kenyans for far too long, and a chapter that this generation must now resolve. This, our generation. The future of Kenya cannot be one in which citizens fear exercising their constitutional rights. Neither can it be one in which legitimate grievances are hijacked by violence, criminality, destruction, and political opportunism, or met by excessive force and violation of constitutional rights. We must reject both extremes. We must protect the right to protest. We must protect life. We must protect property. And we must protect human dignity. And above all, we must remember that before we are protesters, police officers, traders, leaders, or activists, we are Kenyans. Today, we affirm that every life matters. Every victim deserves recognition, and every Kenyan has a right to exercise their constitutional freedoms without fear. Let us therefore hold fast our constitutional rights to peacefully assemble and to non-violence in how we engage one another as citizens, as leaders, or even with our security agencies. This is not an isolated act. I think many leaders here have spoken to how we move together and how sometimes we treat each other not so fairly. This act that we have decided as a nation that we must do, that we must confront what has harmed many people, made us to lose lives, made us to lose property, made us to create division. We must confront as a nation. And I say it is not an act in isolation. It is part of what we are rebuilding as a nation. And it goes beyond money. I have listened very carefully to the governor of Wajir. He was emotional today as he was emotional in Wajir. And because it speaks to how people feel. When I stood on the platform in Wajir on the 1st of June, and the emotion in the field, I saw tears in many leaders and many people in Wajir. It made it look like it was a favor the state was doing for them, when actually it was their right to belong to Kenya, like everybody. They were so emotional about it, you would think we are giving them, or we are making them any favor. But it speaks to how people feel. I remember very well, when I say this is not an isolated incident, I remember very well when, I think it was on the 5th of February 2025, when I stood on the field there at Orahe Stadium in Wajir and signed the proclamation to remove all the encumbrances and the discrimination that was subjected to the people of northern Kenya especially, that made them look like secondary citizens or, citizens of a lesser class than the rest of Kenya. It wasn't about money. It was about dignity. It was about recognizing that there are wrongs that we have committed as a nation to fellow Kenyans, subjecting them, to treatment that went deep into their dignity. When I stood in Mandera and announced the construction of the road from Isiolo to Mandera, it was the same thing, that a whole part of Kenya, by policy, was relegated because of the policy that was said that there are parts of Kenya, section paper number 1, or was it number 10, of 1965, a policy document of government that said some parts of Kenya will be developed and others will not. These are things people take for granted. But as a result of what was done by government, huge sections of Kenya, northern part of Kenya especially, was denied the opportunity to develop like the rest of Kenya. It is still the same thing. That's why I'm saying what we are doing today is part of correcting the injustices of the past. It is the same thing. When I stood 3 months ago in Mombasa and pronounced myself on what we are doing to redress the squatter problem in our coast region that has subjected millions of citizens to the indignity of being squatters, secondary citizens in their own country. They are treated lesser than other Kenyans. It is part of repairing our nation. I remember very well, and this is a good occasion for me to say, when I decided to appoint General Ogolla, I was correcting the negative profiling of some of our communities, that there are positions that are reserved for some people and there are positions that can never be occupied by other people. An injustice and a stigma on a whole community. It needed to be corrected. And it is the same thing when it came to the formation of the broad-based government. I remember very well, my brother, the Honorable Raila Odinga, had a different opinion of who should be the Minister for Finance. And I remember I told him that, my brother, if there is one place I will defy you, is that I am going to appoint a person from Luo Nyanza to be the first cabinet secretary or minister for finance. Again, to correct a negative profiling of a whole community that they don't care about property. You know, property belongs to some people, the economy belongs to some. No. Listen, good people. And it is also the same reason why I have made the decision that development in Kenya is never going to be done again on account of which citizen has voted in which direction. That we are going to develop this nation equally, and every part of Kenya deserves a share of development like any other. That we are going to remove the mentality that there are those who have more shares than others. This is one nation. And finally, when we developed the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, it was also about correcting this nation. You know, there is a perception in Kenya that it is okay for people to be poor. There are people who are made to be poor. There are people who are made to stay in slums. And there are the rest of us. There are people who are supposed to remain jobless. There are people, do you know, for example, good people, when we talk about the people in slums, just explain to me how the rest of us here have houses that have 3, 4 toilets. There is a citizen in Kenya who doesn't have a toilet and has to pay to use a toilet, and it is supposed to be okay. How is that supposed to be okay? What kind of indignity do we make other citizens to go through? That there are people who become sick, but they cannot go to hospital. They will wait to die because they have no way of paying their way in hospital. And it's supposed to be okay. And then, when we rally the country to carry everybody on board, that those of us who have a privilege to have, those of us who have a privilege to have a pay slip, to have a job, can extend our contribution so that we can carry the people in the slums along. We can carry those who cannot go to hospital along. You hear people say, we are defenders of the dignity of the pay slip. So, what about the indignity of being jobless? What about the indignity of suffering in a country that we are all supposed to belong? You know, these are things we must correct. And it doesn't matter, to me, the consequences. We must correct. And so, this occasion, I said at the beginning, is a very solemn occasion. And it is a very consequential occasion. Part of why my good party leader, part of why maybe you got a late invitation, and I thought about it this morning, was because this occasion originally was supposed to be a private occasion. It was supposed to be a small occasion for the commission to come and give me a report. But I said no. You know, there are people who don't know the consequence of this occasion. There are people who underestimate the consequence of this occasion. It is part of us getting and making peace with ourselves as a nation. And I really want to persuade us as leaders to lead from the front. Many people have spoken to how it is easy to dodge this kind of thing. You know, there are so many reports that have been done. You know, one good friend of mine told me, you know, if you go this journey, you could easily be taken to The Hague because you are actually admitting that your government and those others have committed crimes. But so be it. We must confront this occasion. I've had to make very difficult decisions, so this is no excuse. Let's make this one as well, so that we can take the nation forward. And I want to congratulate the Kenya Human Rights Commission. You have done a good job. You've really done a good job. I mean, when somebody does a good job, let us call it what it is. Carry forward. And I have listened to you very carefully, and you have said that we need to make resources available to you and your commission so that you can discharge your responsibility, because it is now almost a requirement that whatever it is we do, whether we are keeping the peace or we are running development, it must be in tandem with the rights of people. And so I agree with you, and I am very happy that you are making this request when everybody is sitting here. The people who appropriate money are sitting here. The people who work on a budget, they are sitting here. The executive is here. The deputy president is here. You are listening to what he has said. The leaders of majority, the leaders of minority, the people who run parliament, our speakers are here. I think the chair, Clarice, and her team deserve the request they have made. Yeah, and all of us will pull from wherever we can to make sure that this happens. As you are aware, this conversation we are having in Kenya is not an isolated conversation. It is the same conversation we will be having tomorrow in France. And we will be having tomorrow a conversation about fairness and about how we treat each other. We will be making, personally, I will be taking a very candid position that as a people, we do not want relationships with others based on dependency. No, we want a relationship of sovereign equality. I will be taking the position tomorrow on a relationship not based on charity, aid, or assistance, but on mutually beneficial partnerships. Not a relationship based on extraction of our resources, but on investment that benefits us and benefits those who are investing. It is a conversation about relationships. How are we living together? We will be pitching for a different international governance and international financial architecture. One that recognizes everybody. You know, we have had a United Nations that exactly treats some as more equal than others. We are saying it is no longer tenable it is no longer acceptable to have an organization that is not representative, that is not democratic, and that is not accountable. We're going to be taking a very firm position, and Kenya will lead the way on behalf of this continent. Because they say any injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And we do not be victims of that. I think there was a saying that when they came for I don't know who, you did nothing. Then they came for the next guy, and then when finally they came for you, there was nobody. So we have to take our position. And that is how we're going to relate. That's how we're going to build a much more fairer world as we build a much more fairer country. Ladies and gentlemen, let the measure of our success not be in how much we pay, but in how much we reform, so that the wounds we tend today are never inflicted again. That is the promise of this day. That is the responsibility of this generation. That is the Kenya we must build together. And this is my solemn commitment to the nation. May God bless you all, and may God bless our country, Kenya. Asanteni.